Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Neuroscience Computational, Tuesday, July 14. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a peculiar thing happening in computational neuroscience right now, and if you only followed the headlines, the brain-scanning breakthroughs, the AI and consciousness think pieces, you'd almost certainly miss it. So let me put it to you plainly at the outset, because it's the thread I want to pull on for the next hour. The most interesting work in the field is no longer really about the brain. It's about the mathematics of comparison, the surprisingly deep and surprisingly unsolved problem of deciding when two systems are doing the same thing. And that problem, it turns out, is the hinge on which nearly everything else swings. Whether an artificial network resembles a cortex, whether a meditator's mind differs from a wandering one, whether a demented brain has lost connectivity or gained it, whether your model of sound localization captures what a barn owl actually does. Underneath all of it sits a single, awkward question. When can we say that this and that are equivalent? You might think that's a settled matter. It is emphatically not. Consider a recent and rather bracing result on comparing dynamical systems. For a while, the fashionable tool has been to take two neural networks, or a network and a brain, approximate their dynamics, and align them through a well-behaved rotation, an orthogonal transformation. Tidy, intuitive, and as it happens, wrong in both directions. Two systems that genuinely compute the same thing may demand a distorted, non-orthogonal change of basis to reveal it, so the tidy method declares them different when they're the same. And two systems that are genuinely different may line up perfectly under rotation, so the method declares them identical when they're not. The correct notion, the one that actually tracks whether two systems are doing the same computation, is topological conjugacy, and it simply does not respect our preference for well-mannered geometry. That's not a footnote. That's the foundation quietly cracking under a decade of comparison studies. Now hold that thought, because it rhymes with something happening elsewhere. There's a growing body of theory about what are called non-normal systems networks, whose connectivity matrices don't commute with their own transpose, which is a technical way of saying the whole edifice can amplify and rotate signals in ways that eigenvalues alone won't tell you. Real cortex is non-normal. Recurrent networks are non-normal. And what people are discovering is that the standard analytical shortcuts, the ones built for normal, symmetric, agreeable systems, leak. The distribution of variance across principal components, the very thing dimensionality reduction rests upon, behaves differently when the underlying dynamics are non-normal. Even the fashionable model of consciousness in this batch, a workspace governed by an imaginary time Schrödinger equation, leans explicitly on a non-Hermitian, non-normal Hamiltonian. It's the same word surfacing in a phenomenology of awareness and in a note on the covariance spectra of random recurrent networks. That is not coincidence. It's a field discovering that the brain does not have the courtesy to be mathematically symmetric, and that most of our intuitions were built assuming it would. So the state of the field, as I read it, is a discipline caught between two ambitions that are quietly in tension. On one side, an enormous appetite for comparison and unification, mapping large language models onto cognitive parcels as though they were fMRI subjects, building virtual brain twins you can personalize in seconds, toolkits that promise to move fluidly across single neuron, population, and network scales. The rhetoric is convergence. Everything is a dynamical system, everything can be aligned, everything can be twinned. On the other side, a steady drumbeat of results insisting that alignment is harder than it looks, that structure at the fine scale, those correlated pairs of synapses, those second-order motifs revealed by connectomics, produces macroscopic behavior that the canonical models simply cannot generate. The microscale refuses to be averaged away, and that tension is productive, not embarrassing. Because notice what the best work is doing. It's not abandoning comparison, it's disciplining it. It's asking precisely what invariance we're entitled to claim. When someone insists a demented brain shows increased connectivity in the precuneus and the insular counterintuitive, since we expect decline, the claim only means something if we're confident the measure is comparing like with like. When someone proposes that meditation raises the brain's signal-to-noise ratio and pushes it toward criticality, The whole construct depends on being able to distinguish goal-relevant variance from endogenous fluctuation, again, a comparison problem wearing a clinical costume. So here is the argument I want to build across our time together. First, that computational neuroscience has quietly become a science of equivalence and its limits, and that this is the unglamorous engine beneath the glamorous claims. Second, that the recurring villain and hero is non-normality, the refusal of real systems to be geometrically polite. And third, that this reframing changes what we should believe when we are told an AI thinks like us, or a twin models us, or practice reshapes us. Let's begin where the trouble is deepest, with the question of when two things are truly the same. There's a temptation, when you survey a season's worth of papers in a field, to see only the churn 100 methods, 100 toolkits, each solving its own narrow puzzle, none of them speaking quite the same language. And yet, if you sit with the material long enough, a shape rises out of it. A deep current running beneath all the local eddies. Let me try to name it. The current is this: the field is quietly abandoning the notion that a neuron or a region or even a whole brain has a fixed identity you can point to. It is replacing the noun with the verb. What matters increasingly is not what a piece of neural tissue is, but what it does over time, the trajectory it traces, the dynamical regime it inhabits, the landscape it moves across. The center of gravity has shifted from the static snapshot to the flowing system. Consider how many of these threads reach, independently, for the same mathematical furniture. We have a model of conscious access built on a complex-valued landscape, a potential well, non-Hermitian, non-normal, through which high-level representations flow toward the threshold of awareness. We have sound localization, that miracle of microsecond precision, reconceived not as a place code where each neuron marks a delay, but as a stable equilibrium of a whole population settling into a valley. We have oscillatory dynamics in recurrent networks described by the language of bifurcations, a system tipping from a static coherent state into noise-sustained rhythm, into stochastic switching between wells, into a global limit cycle. In each case, the explanatory unit is not the component but the flow, and the flow is described by the vocabulary of dynamical systems, attractors, equilibria, wells, transitions. Now this alone would only be a fashion in modeling. What tells me it is a genuine deep current is that a second theme has locked into it, the theme of comparison across coordinates. Because once you decide that computation lives in the shape of the flow rather than in the labeled parts, you inherit a brutal problem. Two systems may implement the very same computation while looking utterly different in their measured coordinates. So how do you tell when two dynamical systems are, in the sense that matters, the same? There is work here arguing that the tempting shortcut aligning systems by orthogonal rotation of their linearized operators is neither necessary nor sufficient to establish that two systems are truly conjugate, truly doing the same thing. That objection is only interesting if you have already committed to the dynamical view. It is a housekeeping problem that arises inside the new house. And notice how the same preoccupation surfaces where you would least expect it. When researchers set out to map the internal organization of large language models, what do they reach for? A cognitive neuroscience framework, parceling the network into functional regions, asking whether those regions form a stable, reproducible organization, whether that organization is conserved across models. That is the comparison across coordinates problem, wearing different clothes. It is the same instinct. Identity is not in the substrate, it is in the reproducible functional geometry. The question, are these two brains doing the same thing? And the question, are these two language models organized the same way? Turn out to be one question, which brings us to the third strand, and to my mind the most telling one, because it concerns stability itself. There is a lovely piece of work distinguishing two very different senses in which a neural code can be reliable. The old sense is temporal stability. Does the population return to the same place across days? The newer, subtler sense is geometric stability. Does the pattern of distances between stimuli reproduce, even when the absolute positions drift? And the finding is that these two come apart. A code can wander in absolute terms while preserving its relational shape. That is the deep current stated almost as a slogan. The meaning is in the relationships, not the positions. The coordinates may swim, the geometry holds. So the trend beneath the noise is a migration of the very concept of identity, of neuron, of code, of computation, even of an artificial agent away from fixed substance and toward preserved structure in motion. It is why we find people asking how to govern an embodied agent whose competence keeps changing without bound. The answer, tellingly, is that you cannot pin it to any fixed model. You must track a lawful trajectory of authorized transitions. Even meditation gets folded in, reframed as the management of a signal-to-noise ratio, a shift of the whole system toward a critical regime, a change not of parts, but of dynamical posture. What unites the potential well, the equilibrium, the bifurcation, the conjugacy, the geometric invariant, the governable individual, is a single conviction, rarely stated aloud, that the brain is best understood as a thing in flow, and that our task is to find what stays constant while it flows. Hold that thought, because in our final passage, I want to ask what it costs us, what we may be quietly giving up when we let the noun dissolve into the verb. What a strange and wonderful pile of papers to have spread across the desk this morning. If you stand back from them, squint a little, the way you might at a pointillist canvas, a shape emerges. And the shape, I think, is what this final stretch of our conversation is really about. Not any single result, but what it means that these results are all appearing at once, elbowing each other in the same corner of the world. Let me start with a tension that runs quietly through nearly everything here. On one side, you have a tremendous appetite for mechanism, for the actual biophysics, the conductances, the dendritic branches, the shunting inhibition that decides which teaching signal reaches which synapse. There is work here inferring Hodgkin-Huxley parameters from the outside of a cell, from extracellular arrays, without ever puncturing the membrane. That is a striking ambition, to reconstruct the hidden machinery from its shadows on a grid of electrodes. On the other side, you have an equally fierce appetite for abstraction, treating conscious access as motion across a complex-valued landscape, describing recurrent networks by the spectrum of a covariance matrix, comparing two brains by asking whether their dynamics are, in the mathematician's sense, conjugate. The field is trying to have it both ways at once. It wants the grease of the actual biology and the clean air of the equations. Now, why should you care that both are happening together? Because the second-order implication, the thing to watch, is that the connective tissue between these two ambitions is quietly becoming the main event. Consider the problem of deciding when two dynamical systems are doing the same computation. It sounds like a technicality. It is not. A good deal of neuroscience proceeds by analogy. This network resembles that network. This model behaves like this brain region, therefore we have understood something. But the work here on conjugacy shows that our standard way of declaring two systems equivalent, aligning them by a rotation, can be both too generous and too stingy. Two genuinely different computations can look aligned. Two genuinely identical ones can look different. That is a load-bearing crack in a very common inferential habit. If your method for saying these are the same is unreliable, then every claim built on that similarity inherits the doubt. You see the same anxiety, dressed differently, in the move from frequentist to Bayesian adjudication of processing pathway maps. The question is no longer merely, is this effect real, but which of several competing models best explains what I'm seeing, a shift from detecting a signal to arbitrating between stories. That is a maturation. A young field asks whether there is anything there at all. A mature one has too many candidate explanations and must learn to choose humbly among them, holding its uncertainty in its hands rather than hiding it behind a threshold. And here is where the artificial systems creep in, which is the implication I'd flag most loudly. There is work mapping the internal features of large language models onto functional parcels, borrowing the very vocabulary of cognitive neuroscience, hierarchy, functional systems, conserved organization. There is work on embodied agents that keep learning after deployment, and the sober recognition that governing such a thing means governing an individual, not a model, because behavioral testing alone will not hold. Notice what has happened. The tools built to understand the biological brain are turning around to interrogate the synthetic one, and the conceptual problems of the synthetic one, identity, drift, credit assignment, when a changing system is still the same system, are precisely the problems the neuroscientists are wrestling with about brains. Conjugacy of dynamics, the persistence of an individual whose competence changes without bound. These are the same question in two costumes. So what should you watch? Watch whether the field's mathematics of sameness, geometric stability, conjugacy, covariance spectra of non-normal dynamics actually stabilizes into shared standards or fragments into lab-specific dialects, which several of these very toolkits are built to prevent. Watch whether privacy-preserving personalization, sharing the model rather than the data, becomes the default posture as brain data grows more valuable and more perilous. And watch, above all, the traffic across the biological-artificial border, because the concepts flowing both ways will shape which questions we are even permitted to ask. There is something almost meditative in that last paper's framing, the mind as a matter of signal-to-noise, of decluttering, of nudging the whole system toward a critical regime where information moves most freely. I'd offer it as the parting image. Perhaps the discipline itself is doing what it studies, raising its own signal-to-noise, learning which of its beliefs are the goal-relevant causes and which are endogenous fluctuation dressed as insight. The work of the coming years is largely the work of decluttering. Watch for that, and you'll be watching the right thing. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.